So thank you, and thank you for indulging us with a slightly delayed kick-off time. Good evening, my name's Lindy Neuenhausen. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Greater Shepparton, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Candidates Forum for the District of Shepparton. Tonight I'm sharing the stage with Max from Shep News, and between us we will be tag-teaming our way through a series of Q&As that have been largely guided by the questions we received at registration and emailed through to Jody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered tonight and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us this evening. We said the same thing at the Federal Candidates Forum way back in April at the start of the year. Standing for politics is an incredibly public and extended job interview, and it takes a lot of courage to put your hand up and to share your convictions with the community and hope they bring their support to you. Last Friday, the Victorian Election Commission confirmed that there are 9 candidates seeking your vote on the 26th of November, and we have been in contact with each of them, or endeavoured to be in contact with each of them, and we're very pleased to say that we have 5 here this evening, all of whom I'm sure have very strong local credentials and connections to their community. For various reasons, the other candidates have declined our invitation to participate at tonight's forum, and so we're very pleased to have the 5 with us tonight. So just quickly, the candidates seeking your vote at the end of this month, or if you want to pre-vote, you could have done so yesterday, Kim O'Keefe for the Nationals, Ian Christo for the Greens, Catherine Taylor for the Animal Justice Party, Sue McGrath for the Labor DLP, Diane Teasdale is here with us tonight from the Freedom Party, Liam Cowan for the Labor Party, Cheryl Hammer for the Liberals, Susanna Sheed, Independent, and Alison White from Family First Victoria.
So, how will tonight run? Shortly, we're going to invite each candidate to deliver a prepared 1-minute introduction, and we'll then move on to a Q&A session. So when answering questions, we'll go from left to right. So, for example, the first one, we'll start with Cheryl and then move along left to right, and then from the question after that, Ian will be the first to answer left to right and then back to Cheryl. That way, one person doesn't have to answer first every time for the evening. So Lindy and I, as she mentioned, have been working through the questions that were submitted largely by you, but we won't be asking every single question because there are a lot of them. We've done our best to combine the topics into a series of questions to ensure they're relevant to the Victorian Government and Victorian Government's responsibility, and also topics of interest in this election. And if time permits, we will try and open the floor, but you're welcome to follow up your individual questions with individual candidates who we've managed to convince to stick around for a little while after the forum concludes, or on the flyers you've got website information, and there are contact details on that there if you want to get in touch with them. And obviously keeping the evening to time is important. So our timekeeper Jodie Fleming in the front row will raise some flags when our candidates are getting close to their minute, and she'll also ring the bell if candidates are not finished by the 1 minute, and if they keep going, I've got someone backstage with one of those old-fashioned hooks to just yoink them off. So let that be the warning to you guys.
So thanks, Max. Let's begin, and in alphabetical order, I invite our candidates to deliver their 1-minute introduction and pitch for your vote. So beginning with Ian.
Oh, well, good evening, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name's Ian Christo, standing for the Greens. I'm a farmer from Undira, and I'm a father and now a grandfather, I'm pleased to say. I'm standing for election because I have 2 main passions that I feel are not being addressed currently with either major party. I want to see a fair and just society, and I don't believe that's being fully addressed. I want to see a healthy and secure environment, the natural environment. And as a farmer, I think one of the things it's taught me is that One is that we need to nurture the land that we work, but we should also leave it in a better state than when we receive it. And I believe that applies to society and how we treat the wider environment. We should nurture things and leave them better than when we come to this planet. And that's my time. Thank you.
So our next one is Cheryl. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Cheryl Hammer. I'm the Liberal candidate for the seat of Shepparton. I'm a small business owner, a farmer, a former CEO, a mother and community volunteer. I'm backing small business, including horticulture and agriculture, to grow our local economy, with 97% of the 16,000 or so businesses in our region recognised as small business. I'm advocating for choice in public secondary school education to be reinstated in Greater Shepparton, and I've committed to a second secondary school. I'm a strong supporter of sport and sporting clubs in our region for a healthier, more connected community, both for young and older residents. I'm a mother of 3 young men, so I have a front row seat to the challenges around housing, both availability and price, meaningful full-time employment, and the cost of living, which prevents them from saving for their future. I want to rid our state of crippling debt, which our children and theirs will have the responsibility of paying back. I'm acutely aware of the challenges facing our newly arrived communities with most of the issues I've already mentioned, and want to be a part of future solutions. I'm working very hard to have a Liberal government govern Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Our next one is Kim O'Keefe.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight, and I'm running as the candidate for the National Party, and it's a very important time for all of us, and it's one of the major reasons I'm actually running for State Parliament is because I believe that I've got a great background. I've had a lot of experience having 6 years in local government, raising my children here, having a business here for over 28 years. I understand the challenges of small business. I also understand the needs of big business, and we have very big business across our region. We have very successful businesses running. We're actually highlighted as one of the most successful regional cities across the country, and we need to really make sure that that bright light stays on our region and that we get the investment and we get the opportunities that our communities deserve. Coming out of the pandemic and coming out of floods, I believe I'm a compassionate and really determined leader that will help our community work together to really meet the many challenges that we are facing right now. It's an incredible time for all of us, and I think it's a time of change for leadership. There's certainly some things that haven't been done, and I think it's time that I make that happen in this role. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. The next one is Susanna.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to address you all. I've been the independent member for Shepparton District for the past 8 years, and it's been a fantastic journey. I feel very honoured to have had the community place the trust in me to elect me twice to the Victorian Parliament, and it's been just so good to be able to be in a position where you can work with the government of the day to deliver on a whole range of things that we needed. And when I stood in 2014, there were a number of things that I wanted to do, and I can honestly say I've delivered them all except the bypass, and that's certainly on the list. It's one of the reasons I want to go back. It's about access to health services, it's about the state of our roads, it's about education for our children, it's about who we are, and it's about the community that we all in our town serve, and that's the agricultural and horticultural communities that we have across the GMID, which are really needing good representation at the moment. So I'm putting up my hand for another term to see if we can maintain the momentum that we've developed over the last 8 years.
Thank you. And finally, Diane.
Hello, thank you, and thank you for having us here tonight. I appreciate it. Many of you will know my political activity in the past, but probably wondering why I'm working with the Freedom Party. I have been very disturbed over the last few years about the lockdowns and the mandates, and followed Morgan Jonas very closely. The overriding of our constitution by forcing people to have vaccinations is a big concern to me. I think we should have the freedom to choose as our constitution states. Now, I don't know whether you realise it, but hundreds of people from Shepparton went to those marches in Melbourne. There was up to 100,000 at one march. And I'm concerned that the censorship from the media on what was going on has given people a false idea of how many people are concerned about this. The forcing of young people to be vaccinated is very disturbing for me. I have 12 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild, and I'm concerned for their future and their health. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, candidates. The federal election earlier this year saw a Labor government elected with a large number of crossbench independents and a green slide. And we fully appreciate that pollsters and betting sites and all of that can get it very, very wrong, and we've seen it happen before. But at the moment, we've got a prediction for a narrow win to Labor in Victoria, or a minority government, likely Labor's way, with increased representation from minor parties and from independents. So before we get stuck into the nuts and bolts of the questions tonight, we're going to do just a few specific questions. So firstly to Cheryl, this is your second run for the seat of Shepparton. You ran in 2018, and if you were elected then, you would have been in opposition for this term to work with the government to achieve those outcomes. So we've got 3 questions to kick off. So under that scenario, if you were in opposition, do you think you would have achieved more than the current member?
Yeah. Thinking about being in opposition, I've been asked this quite a lot over this campaign. I actually believe my role in opposition would have been to hold the government to account. We do have a member at the moment who is more a Labor voting member, and I think in opposition we would be able to strongly advocate for the needs of the region, similar to independent member, but also be able to hold them to account if they're not delivering. We do have a Labor government. They've been in government for 19 out of the last 23 years. They're addicted to announcements and re-announcements, and I think a strong opposition or somebody in this region who would be prepared to stand up and hold the government to account to deliver. I use the trains as an example. It's taken them 8 years to deliver what they have claimed they were going to deliver for Shepparton, and we're still waiting on the 9 services. So I think someone in opposition, and being a strong opposition, could have delivered just as well.
So looking forward, say Labor is re-elected and you're in the seat as well, what do you think would be the reason that you could do more than not just the current member but anyone else on the panel or running tonight? Why do you think you'd be able to do more in the seat?
Well, I think the way you approach it as well is going to be really important. We could have a very combative approach to that and, see it as government and opposition. I think if we all identify, and certainly the local community identifies the major issues and the things, the infrastructure as well as services, other things that are called for in this region, if they're good projects, and we advocate strongly for them, that potentially a government, could see it the same way. I think there's a leadership style and a way that you could actually work with. I was asked the question just recently around education, and someone said, well, with the Labor government, but I'd be happy to work with anybody at that situation if it meant to deliver something for our region. So I think a strong opposition, we shouldn't underestimate what a strong opposition and a strong advocate from this area could do.
Yep, and then finally, obviously, you would like the coalition to be elected. If that's the case, what would your aspirations be if the coalition was in power and you were the member?
Yeah, well, we're actually fighting hard for a Liberal government to govern, so I am concentrating on that and that scenario. Debt is a huge one. I think we've really got to become better financial managers. The cost of living at the moment, we need to find some solutions around that, and I think a lot of our policies, which we have been very transparent about, speak a lot to be able to tackle those cost of living, and certainly it's the concern for young people trying to get ahead, as I said, through housing, through employment, through their savings. I would be very strong on that, as well as our very regional and very local focused issues.
Thank you. Kim, hello. In your role as Mayor and Councillor, you've worked closely with our local member and with the government, to achieve outcomes for Shepparton over the last couple of years. We assume you probably reflected on this experience when you decided to run. Did you consider running as an independent or with any other party? And, if so, what made you turn them down?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, being 6 years with local government is working with government, and I was really fortunate to have that experience and to see firsthand what the benefits can be for our communities when you work closely together. And I think it's a really good point to raise that it's the 3 tiers of government that have achieved for our region, not just the state member. So that's a really important thing to think about. And I was part of a lot of that. That investment, that opportunity for our region. And it's not just the 3 tiers of government, it's also Committee for Greater Shepparton, many stakeholders in the room, many community members that fight for our region. So, reflecting on it, I think it's a really important time for me to think about the party that I'm with. And as we know, the National Party represent regional Victoria, and we always have to really raise the issue of regional Victoria not getting its fair share. And from the Nationals, we are solely focused on regional Victoria, so a very good fit for me. Running as independent, it would be very difficult. I like the idea of having a party behind me, and I like the idea of being part of a team and having a voice at the table.
And similar to the question to Cheryl, do you think you would have done more in the last 4 years than the current member if you were elected in the current term with Labor in power?
Sorry, it's a bit hard.
Do you think you would have done more in the last 4 years if you had been in power? Similar to the question just asked to Cheryl as an opposition member.
Yeah, look, I think, what we've experienced through COVID, and what we had to accept as far as, having the longest lockdowns in regional Victoria and some of the pandemic restrictions has impacted our community, and it's very ongoing what that impact has been. We've lost many businesses. I certainly would have perhaps advocated more strongly in regard to the lockdowns, in regard to the things that, as a regional city, as I said, we're the longest lockdown regional city in the country. I would have been perhaps a lot more on the ground and a lot more vocal to the impact that has done, and we're seeing it, it's going to continue to do to our community for a very long time.
And if Labor's re-elected, how would you have more impact as the member for Shepparton than anyone else running?
Yeah, well, I hope Labor's not elected. We certainly all, we know that Labor government is not a regional government. It's a government that doesn't give regional Victoria their fair share. But the National Party has a very strong and long successful history, whether being in government or not. We've got an amazing record when you look back on some of the things we have achieved both federally and state, over the years. It's over a 100-year-old party. It's the country party, the party for the people. And, as a member of the National Party, and if I'm in opposition, again, it's, calling them to account, bringing the government to account, and also making sure that our voice is heard. We can't be silenced. We have to be vocal, and we have to be heard, and we have to be valued. And I think, we all live in one country, and every voice within our country, regardless whether it's in our state, we all deserve to be treated equally. Our regions deserve the investment equally. And I certainly will try and make some change in regard to getting our fair share in regional Victoria.
Yeah. And Susanna, over the course of the campaign, you've spoken about, your role being to work with the government of the day, in this case Labor, to work and get outcomes for the electorate. And heading into the election, we've had a long list of current Labor ministers announce their retirement, in key portfolios, education and water are big ones for us. Looking ahead, we're also likely to see, if the polls are correct, a large number of independents competing, with you to secure outcomes for their electorate in the crossbench. So if Labor's re-elected and given the departure of so many ministers, how will you have more of an impact than other members on the panel or other members running, and more impact than the independents you might be sharing the crossbench with?
So I suppose when you look at the number of ministers who are leaving, there's no doubt that when I see Lisa Neville, for instance, leaving, it's very disappointing because we've had a long-term relationship on water with her and a great working relationship, and various other ministers. But most of the new ministers are ministers that arrived in Parliament pretty much when I did 8 years ago. So I know a lot of those people and a lot of people on both sides of the House, and of course there's been 2 other independents. If there are more independents in the Parliament, and everyone's saying there won't be a hung Parliament, it'll just be a Labor government with a reduced majority and a few more maybe Liberals and so forth, then I think, from my point of view, I'm there to work with them, but I do have an absolutely driving passion to try and get some reform into the lower house of the Victorian Parliament. In the upper house where Wendy sits, they get almost a day where they bring up issues for their community. In the lower house, we don't get that. I've spoken about it many times in Parliament. You can see it on Facebook, you can see it in Hansard and many other places. There's a lot to be done because the opposition can't be an effective opposition unless we get some of those reforms through.
Yep. Sorry, can people hear me better now? I've just been told that I was a bit quiet. That better? Like that? There we go. All right, sorry about that. Secondly, Susanna, you've often spoken about the fact that Labor's 20-seat majority meant the government hasn't needed to woo your vote, as it were. So the majority is predicted to reduce, could become a minority government. So if you get the phone call asking to join a minority government or to provide assurances to secure Labor's control in the lower house, how will you respond? Do you rule out, guaranteeing supply to a Labor government?
Look, I certainly won't be joining any other party. I'm an independent. I've always stood as an independent, and that won't be changing. If there are enough independents there to have some sort of balance of power, I hope that they will see that the long list of integrity reforms that I have ready to go, typed up, ready to go, not that anyone in the city wants to know about them yet, but I think if we were in that position, there's a real opportunity to get a bit of reform happening in that lower house and to then give the opposition a chance to be opposition. Oppositions can't introduce private members' bills, so we don't debate anything. We can't move motions, so we can't debate anything. We can't... Yeah, I know, and not in the lower house, the House of Government. It's just outrageous that we're in that sort of situation. So that, along with things that I want to keep fighting for my community, and also the representation we need on water is obviously important. And just having had a meeting with the Federal Water Minister yesterday on these issues, I think I'm well placed to just continue in that role of advocating for our community.
And finally, brings us to the obvious question: if the pundits and the pollsters get it wrong and the coalition is elected and you're the member, how will you have more of an impact than the other candidates on the panel?
Well, I'll be able to hold them to account too, and I think that's something we'll want to do, because it's pleasing to see that unlike in 2014, when hardly anyone came to town or made a promise in Shepparton and the region, this time quite a lot of promises have been made, so we'll want to see those promises fulfilled. And I think everyone is of the understanding that the bypass is something really critical to our community. And I've had both the National Party and the Liberal parties support me in recent months on the requests I've made for parliamentary reform, so I would hope they would stand by that and support that level of change that's required.
Cheryl, Kim, Susanna, thank you for that. We'll now move on to our policy questions.
Okay, thanks, Max. So our next topic is about access to health services in our region, and it's on video.
Hi, I'm Vicky Scott. I'm currently receiving cancer treatment. I'm really interested to hear from the candidates about how you're going to ensure that our region has access to first-class, world-class health facilities, including access to specialists. This is something that's very, very important, and I'm very, very interested to hear from the candidates about that tonight.
So before we jump to answers, there's just a few points we'd like to build into your responses and dive a little deeper on this. So Kim and Cheryl, both of your parties have promised to abandon the suburban rail loop and to fund components of GV Health's redevelopment, but not the entire scope of the redevelopment that's required. So firstly, what is the difference between the Libs and the Nats on this issue? So which one should I put higher on my ballot? And secondly, under a coalition government, where does full completion of GV Health's redevelopment sit in the queue for funding? We saw Mildura's just received a promise of $750 million. We've received $100 million. And then for Susanna and Ian, what's your strategy to get the full GV Health redevelopment to the front of the queue? So I'll now hand over, and as we said, we start from the left. So Cheryl.
Okay. Yeah, so we have committed to a cancer centre, a larger cancer centre, $100 million, which will deliver nearly 3 times the size of a cancer centre, and also and more extensive services that are needed here in country areas, which will obviously benefit people like we've heard from Vicky, which is really important too. So many people are having to travel very long periods of time, both to Melbourne and other centres for services, particularly at their lowest time. So a cancer centre was very, very important. We heard that from the community to deliver. In terms of the policy, it's a coalition policy, so asking me to differentiate, between the Nationals and the Liberals. It is a coalition policy, so no use trying to extend on that. So we're delighted that it is the cancer centre. It's been called for a very long time, and we're happy to extend the services.
So just going in a bit on that, so in terms of the full redevelopment of GV Health, where does that sit in the priorities when we're seeing funding for so many of the other regional hospitals that's significantly above what has been promised for Shepparton?
Yeah, well, we do have a hospital that's only half the development of what you say before it's actually completed. It's high on our priority. Health and health services, very high on our priority. We've met with the hospital a number of times and spoken to them about where they're at with the progression of the completion. We're not talking in stages anymore, and in fact it was the Liberals that started talking about the completion rather than in number of stages of the hospital, which has always been, or the last 4 years in particular, that's been the language around the hospital, how many stages will be. So we've introduced and we started talking about the completion of the hospital. It is very much a high priority for us. We've also having to take the lead from the hospital as well in their advocacy. We need the business case, we need the costings, we need exactly what that looks like. And we're talking to the hospital all the time to be able to advocate very strongly for them. It is only half built, you're right. We can't take it off the list by any means. It's really important, and that fits into our clinical school announcement as well.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Ian?
Provision of services is fundamental to a well-functioning society, and the Greens definitely support health in particular as being an essential government service that needs to be well supported. So it makes a lot of sense to have a well-functioning hospital in regional areas such as the Hume region, which is based in Shepparton. So, I'm aware of stage 2, the redevelopment there, and I'd like to see that going ahead and completed as quickly as possible. I can't go into details about timeframes and how it's prioritised against other projects, but definitely it's something I'd like to see completed. But it's not just the cancer centre. The emergency treatment in the hospitals being overwhelmed needs to be better resourced because GPs now are rarely bulk billing, and so people are going to hospital emergency departments and they need to be resourced appropriately.
Thank you. Kim?
So we put health as a priority, and as we should. I mean, we know that the people within our communities and across the state, if not across the country, the health sector is in a crisis. The waiting list, elective surgeries is about 90,000 people across the state. So, it's really disappointing to think here we are 8 years with an independent and we still haven't got our finished hospital. We still haven't got the bypass. So there's, to me, health should be the number one. Those two things are our number one priorities, I think, across our community, and they're still not delivered. So, as from my point of view, it's a priority. I will certainly lobby to get the full development. We are still waiting to see what that looks like. As Cheryl said, we did meet with the hospital, with Matt Sharp, but they haven't completed the design. I mean, it's very difficult to fund things if you haven't got a finished design completed or a full business case. So, you know, it's a priority. It will be my number one thing, you know, to get the health redevelopment. As I said, 8 years later, we still haven't got it. Look at Bendigo and other major regional cities that have these incredible hospitals, and we've got it patched up, you know, not completed. So definitely a priority. You know, health needs to be on top of our list, and I'm on time. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Susanna?
So I'm trying to go back to Vicky's question, which was about really, I think, access to health services, and I've heard that that is really one of the major issues across the region, everywhere I've been. And you know, Peter Eastor's just retired, Dan Garrick's just retired, Adrian Bunkle's just retired, 3 long-term specialists in the community who've gone. David Ball's about to retire, John McKellar's gone in Maroopna. The access to health service is appalling in our region, and the hospitals are part of the story, but the emergency department isn't there to treat, you know, minor ailments. It's there for serious illnesses, hospitalisations and emergencies and the like, and it needs to keep getting built. We've had $230 million. We've got the new mental health unit that will start being built very shortly. So it's just a progression of funding that I've already got and that is still coming, and I think that just needs to roll on. But it doesn't address what's happening in the community, and I think that is the biggest challenge of all. How do we attract professionals into this community and get them to stay here?
Thank you. Diane?
The Freedom Party is very concerned about the amount of nurses and doctors who aren't working at the moment because they have made the decision to not get vaccinated. And I think that this is a very important issue because there's thousands of them out there that could be working in our hospitals now helping people who are sick. I also admire the aged care nurses and the work that they've had to do because that's been very, very difficult for them. But we're talking about more treatment, more things for cancer, but how about we look at alternate or complementary medicine, which I'm very much in favour of. I'm a great supporter and admirer of Avni Sali and his work with NIIM, and if I had the power to do it, I would call him in to run something that would change the way we look at health in this country to get people back to being healthier. The other thing I think we should be doing is training doctors and nurses without HECS fees. We're short of Australian doctors and good nurses, and yet we charge them so much money. They have to go into a massive debt to get trained. These people they're an asset to us and they're important, and I think it's time we looked at this a different way.
So just to explore that a little further, Diane, in addition to your aspirations for complementary medicine, with regard to GV health, what is your strategy and Freedom Party's strategy and policy to help us get that to the front of the queue for funding under the next government?
Well, I just think we need more doctors and more nurses on the job. The ones there are doing a great job under great duress. There isn't enough of them. They're flying in doctors at weekends to look after people. This is just ridiculous. So we should be able to attract people here to work. We've got to look and find out what that problem is and overcome that.
Yep, so that's about the workforce issue, but the infrastructure issue, so the actual build of the hospital, is there a plan that your party has to progress development of GV health?
Well, we're a wealthy country here, and I don't think we put enough money into health. I think a lot of the government thing is on trying to save money in areas where we should be spending money, and I think that this is something that we need to look at here, getting more resources here, getting more doctors on the job.
All right, thank you.
Well, our next question does lead into some of those answers, talking about workforce in regional areas. So, you know, we've had workforce shortages well before the pandemic, and they've been made worse by international travel restrictions. I want to know from the candidates, what are your priorities to growing the short and long-term workforce in the region, and how will your policies give Greater Shepparton an advantage over other regional cities and regions? Ian, we'll start with you. We'll move along so that Ian's starting first.
Well, there are all sorts of people that are required. So one of the problems that we have is a shortage of affordable housing. So, look, if we may be addressing the housing issue later, but look, I'd like to see an enormous build of affordable housing in the region, so particularly so that workers can attract, or businesses can attract workers that can have somewhere affordable to stay. But it's also a matter of some of the more intangible things, such as access to the arts and creativity, good education, services like that, sports facilities for professionals and people that have other interests. So, good early childhood education. It's all about having a community with plenty of services, affordable accommodation, and we've got the jobs, so we just need to get people here.
Thank you. Kim?
So we have such a broad sector of the workforce, but we have some policies in place quite broadly. For example, we have the 40,000 new nurses and midwives, 325 million workforce plan for the health sector alone. And that would be offering some scholarships and incentives to really get people either upskilled or reskilled. It's really important to make sure that dollars aren't an issue when it comes to getting people particularly into health and nursing, etc. Looking across the region, there's so many ways we can work with sector, with agriculture, with so many different providers within employment opportunities and skill sets that we need to align with and work with, and I think that's the driving factor to make sure where are the gaps. In a regional area there will be skill shortages and there will be quite large gaps. Where do we fill first? So I think that's a really important policy to work through and make sure that we can actually lead and be on the front foot of where those major gaps are that are going to make the biggest difference.
Where do you think those major gaps are, and how do we fill them? What is that policy?
Yeah,
that
so we've
you're
obviously
looking
addressed health as the number one, and we've got some policy around that. You only have to talk to any of the orchards locally. They're finding it very difficult to get hands on the ground, hands on the trees. Agriculture's a big one. I mean, then you go to small business, hospitality, you talk to any business at the moment. So it is very broad. I mean, how do you rope it in one policy? I think it needs to be broken up into a few, diverse type of opportunities to bring policies in. But I think the big thing is that there is such a shortage, and we know that that's international visitors not coming. We know it's students not coming. We know that there's lots of reasons why people are staying put, a lot more than what they used to. They're not coming into regional Victoria for work. We know they're coming here to live, and we know there's a whole different conversation around housing and people seeing a different opportunity. But as far as workforce shortages, it's very broad, and it needs to be really considered about how we can make it fit for our region and being very specific.
Thank you. Susanna?
So workforce shortages are not peculiar to our region. It's a national problem, and we have a number of things we do that probably make it less attractive. For a start, immigration is going to be necessary. We had 160,000 backpackers in Australia before COVID, and most of them went straight home before the borders closed and during that time. So they haven't come back. Very few have come back. How do we make them come back and get back in the workforce and fill up so many of the jobs that are out there? But I think when people want to move to a country area, they want to know that they've got access to health services, good health services, that their kids will get an education, and that they can have that sort of housing they want. And that's the challenge that we have here in this region. So the housing situation, and I think you'll probably get onto that separately, but
yes, we will. Yes,
that is a very significant challenge, and it's a challenge right now for emergency housing. So there's the short-term, long-term, and the medium term as well that needs to be looked at in that space to get people here as well.
Thank you. Diane?
Look, I'm concerned that some of this labour shortage thing is a bit of a red herring, because I get the Shepparton News every day and I don't see ordinary jobs for ordinary people in that paper at all. I know a few people that have struggled to find work, and I think that a lot of it is that a lot of these people are being very noisy about unemployment, are looking for cheap and compliant labour, which is you know, something that the people that we brought in from overseas were providing. We need to look after those businesses we've got here. We've got good businesses here employing people, and we're not looking after them well enough. And when we see government grants go to large businesses to provide people, and then the next thing they're whinging because they're short of labour, and I think, no, let's get back to small business, which is what Australia and Shepparton was built on. Let's respect those people that we have here that employ people, and let's look after our own first.
And finally, Cheryl.
Yeah, worker shortages comes up all the time. It's a huge issue, right from door knocking, talking to people face to face who may have been impacted themselves with not being able to get staff, and also talking to a lot of businesses, small businesses, but also in the agriculture and horticultural sector. One of our policies is that we've announced a clinical school here to actually train up to 300 nurses and some other allied professionals or allied services. We're hoping that training them here, and it has been proven, that training people here are more likely to stay here and live here and put some roots down. So hopefully that will be a way, admittedly in a longer term, but we're actually trying to identify areas where we can try and make some inroads into those worker shortages. I agree housing is probably the number one barrier to getting people to come here or to look at our region for employment, but not being able to find the housing and potentially the education for their families that they need.
Thank you.
Still yours.
Am I? My script doesn't have the rest of this question,
Okay.
obviously, so it's all yours.
I'll wing it. Okay, so great that you raised housing, because it's a lovely segue to this next part. Looking inside our own backyard of people who are already resident in our community, unemployment rates in regional Victoria are at all-time lows, but this result's dominated by youth, non-English speakers, Indigenous and long-term unemployed. Last week's Doorbells Candidates Forum that many of you attended highlighted how many trained professionals are living in our region but unable to work because of accreditation, visa or language issues. And then we also know that if female participation rates in Greater Shepparton alone increased to match that of males, there'd be an extra 4,000 females working in Greater Shepparton. So when we look at who's already in our backyard that we could be bringing into the workplace, and at a time when employers are desperate for local staff, what programs and policies will you drive to help us activate that pool of potential employees that are already living in our region? And Kim, your first cap.
Yeah, sure. So housing, as we've all said, is a huge issue. We've got the highest rate of homelessness across the state, and this is prior to what we've just experienced with floods. And it's a massive issue, and I think one of the biggest things we know, I mean, there's a whole range of things happening here, but we know that we don't have the land unlocked to actually build housing at the moment. So we've actually brought in a policy where we'll actually fast-track 50,000 new lots across regional Victoria. And that will actually, we'll also bring in a flight team to help council manage that extra workload, because I know myself, there's a lot of time and a lot of red tape when it comes to, getting things done, and we need to fast track that. But, I'm very concerned about homelessness and across all sectors. It's all very well to have land and unlock land and build houses and all that type of thing, but it comes also down to the money that people have and don't have. So one of my major aspirations will be to really focus on homelessness and all levels of homelessness and housing across our region. I see people sleeping rough. It's interesting during the floods. We actually manage that. I was talking to CEO Peter Harriott that we were actually able to manage homelessness. We were able to manage hard rubbish during the times of the floods. I mean, I know there's costs there, but things can be done.
So, Kim, we will do a deep dive on one of our questions on housing shortly, but in particular I was interested to know on this question was around the people that are already living in our community that could be in the workforce locally, that may require additional support or guidance to be in the workplace. What policies or programs are you looking to advocate for or enable delivery of if you are elected as our member for Shepparton?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the middle of the question.
It's about, we already have a large population in Shepparton who's either unable or need additional support in order to make it into the workplace. What additional programs and services are you advocating for or looking to deliver that would allow us to tap into that existing resource to boost our current workforce.
Yeah, and we live in such a multicultural community, so we need to be able to, manage that, and it's very complex. I think one of the main things to get people assisted is really working with other stakeholders, and obviously a policy needs to be perhaps more targeted around that. I think the thing about our community is because it is so diverse, it's very difficult to really cover each individual. The other night at Doorbells, it was very complex. I know they walked away saying they didn't really have enough answers to some of the things that they asked for. And I think when it comes to, getting people into their right environment and housing and employment, it's the other night what we heard was that they were living in houses with 10 different people and trying to get support behind them, but it wasn't there. So I think there does need to be more specific policies to do that. And at this stage, I think it's a matter of just really listening and making sure that we, as we were told the other night, to really listen and hear the gaps again that aren't there.
Thank you. Susanna?
So I think, if you want to get women back in the workforce, they need childcare. And that is, for a very significant proportion of the female population, working population, it's an issue. And it's largely a federal issue, and so too are the issue of visas, and all these women we have and men in our community here who've come from overseas, have qualifications and can't do what they want to do, who are waiting for visa registrations to change. All these sorts of things are actually federal issues. Now, I think from my point of view, it's really important to be able to work with your state government, to get them to work with the federal government to highlight a lot of these issues. And for us, for me as an independent, to also work directly with the federal government where I can. We've done that on water. We could hopefully do it on immigration. We've met with the shadow immigration minister before he became the immigration minister. I think there's a lot of conversations that can be had to draw attention on this region and try and free up some of the barriers that are really stopping people who are already here working.
Thank you. Diane?
I haven't got any particular ideas. I found that during the mandates and the lockdowns that many people who were working but didn't need to necessarily financially have retired out of the workforce. Nurses and a lot of people that just said, well, I rather like being home. I'm quite happy for them to do that. I don't think as a government we have to organise people for businesses when they're looking for staff. It's up to the businesses to train them. And we need to make it easier for them to train them. I've got 4 children all in business, and some of them have put through apprentices in the past, but they're finding the standards of the kids coming through is not good enough. They're just too hard work to train, and so they've given up on it. But if we could encourage them back and help fund the training of people in the workforce, there's a lot of young people out there who would love to have good jobs and be well trained, but the people that are running these businesses simply can't afford to put them on. So I'd like to look at that side of it, the training and education of young people and other people to get back in the workforce that way.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yeah, again, women in the workforce is a huge one. Speak to a lot of different groups as well as individuals, and childcare does come up all the time, and not necessarily just the cost of it, but the availability or being able to access places. I had a couple of fathers, actually young fathers, tell me the other day that we should build more childcare centres, and that would fix it, and if it was only that easy. I do understand it is a federal issue, but again, I think if it's something that's happening in our community, we need to be advocating really strongly. Also agree around access to training and education or re-education, retraining for women. Make that easier for them to access to maybe have the confidence or the wherewithal to re-enter or enter the workforce. And also the multicultural women who we did hear from, and I'm sure there's men as well. We really need to do more to remove the barriers, the time and the energy that it takes to have their qualifications acknowledged and be able to enter the workforce. And I'd also like retired or semi-retired people if they'd consider re-entering the workforce, might help our region.
Ian.
Yeah, well, I'll back up the childcare issue. It's a very big one, and it's an expensive process, looking after kids. But being largely a federal issue, it's limited room for the state government to do much there. But we do have, or the state government that is, has the levers on the TAFE machine, and I'm a fan of TAFE and what it could do if it was well funded. It hasn't been well funded for a long time, if ever really. But that would be the ideal facility to bring perhaps new arrivals back up to speed with their skills and their language ability, and for the broader community to get the skills that the local employment community is looking for.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to dive into the subject that all of you have touched on already, which is housing. And there's three parts to this question. I'm trying not to make this sound like a VCE exam, but we have broken it down into a few different components. So firstly, we know Greater Shep needs about 400 houses a year for the next decade, just to keep up with demand. It's about the same pace we've been growing at for the last decade. So we know that needs to happen, and we know that there's that land supply is well short of the benchmarks that we would like to have available to support that. There's also a possibility that on the back of some floods there may be some changes or potential delays to how we can access and release further land. So that's the first part. The second part is we know we need a greater variety of housing with a lot more 1 and 2 bedroom options located close to work in the CBD and across all income ranges, especially for executives, students and key workers that we need in our CBD areas. And then finally, Greater Shepparton has a higher proportion of renters than many other regional areas in Victoria, and we need a strong rental market to provide options for professionals, key workers and others moving to the region and locals who can't or don't want to buy. So starting with the first part, starting with land supply, what do you intend to do to address our land supply challenges, and how will this impact on the ground in Shepparton? And before we start, just very quickly for Kim and Cheryl, conscious that your policies include proposals to fast-track release of 50,000 housing lots across Victoria, given our current issues and our lack of land supply that's ready to go, how can you give us assurance, or can you give us assurance that we won't miss out on those opportunities? So I think we're starting with Susanna now, yes? So land supply, what do your solutions look like?
Look, I've met with developers on a couple of occasions, many occasions really, just who bemoan the fact that everything takes too long, that land availability is restricted, that rezoning takes too long, that planning takes too long, and that they're the sort of complaints I hear. I'm concerned that the windfall tax that was introduced recently will also have an impact on our regional areas, and I moved an amendment in the lower house to try and have that excluded from regional areas, and fortunately the Nats and the Libs supported me in that when I moved that amendment. But I think it is important to not put undue sort of restraints on people who might be farmers close to town who are actually keen to have their land developed, then just draw back and think, well, any profit I make is going to, get a whacking great tax on it. I think that's one thing that needs to be addressed very quickly. It needs to be repealed, and in 1 minute, that was probably all I could say about that.
Okay, Diane.
There's plenty of land around Shepparton that could be subdivided. I was involved with the Arcadia Downs development many years ago. The councils and the Shire in those days that did it, they were hopeless, absolutely hopeless. It went on and on and on. We need people in the council who are dedicated to getting some of this land opened up. The developers pay for the costs, so it's not like council is asked to provide it all. They need to get their act together, and I think state government needs to encourage that. And we could open more land and industrial land as well, if the will was there and they all got their act together. That's my opinion anyway.
Thank you. Cheryl?
I'm going to talk in dot points because there's a lot in
Okay.
there for 1 minute, and I haven't met time yet once. So, so the land release, just to clarify that, this is land that we've already identified that's in limbo. So it'll be fast tracking it. We're not going out and looking for parcels of land that we're going to say someone should develop that. This is actually in limbo, and we've identified that through local councils in the regions that we've already spoken to. So we will get our fair share because developers tell me as well that the land's there ready to go and we have an opportunity to do more. The variety, I'm a big fan of trying to educate our community that we need high density living. People coming out of Melbourne or other major cities are wanting like for like. They don't want 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom, rambling, mowing lawns all weekend. They want to go in inner city, live in apartments, go to dinner, you know, in the CBD every night. So I'm a big fan of that, and I know the Committee 4 have got a lot of plans in place to really push that. Renters, we've got to do more. That is a universal problem at the moment. And while we've got housing shortage, yeah, we're out of time again. While we've got a housing shortage, it's going to be really difficult. Yeah, windfall tax, we need to get rid of it. I think we will when we're elected.
Thank you. Ian?
Well, I'm not a big fan of open slather development for housing. It has to be done in a targeted way. I'm not a huge fan of big blocks on the far edges of town where services are difficult to supply and density is very low. And I'm not a fan of abolishing the windfall tax. I think there's a reason for that. It's that people are making windfall profits without having actually had to do anything for it. I would like to see greater density of housing, particularly in closer to the city centre where it's close to amenity, people less reliant on having a car or 2 cars. And not everyone wants to be mowing lawns on weekends or watering gardens when water's expensive. It's not what everyone wants, but it seems to be what developers are providing. So a better infill in the cities with higher density housing is high on my list.
Thank you. Kim?
Yeah, so the land unlocked 50,000, we've talked about that, but you know, I'm very concerned when we talk about affordable housing, rental properties. You know, you look back in the early 70s when they had what we called the commission housing back then. It really catered for low income families. We don't have that happening. We need to really look at strong policies that will help every person have a roof over their head. We don't want to leave anyone behind when it comes to housing. And I'm very concerned about the increase that's happening because we know people are coming into regional Victoria. They're used to spending more money on houses. They're paying higher dollars, and that's put a really huge increase into housing. I'm very concerned about what the future looks like, and there has to be very strong, determined policies around sustainability and also making sure that, you know, we all look at progress and the things we want to see developed and increased, but, you know, what does that mean into the future? How do we stop people coming in? We don't want to stop people coming in, but we've got to be able to manage it. And I think it's the management of land and the diversity of the offerings is what's really at play here. We need to really look at our region and how we can actually look at inner city living, you know, rental properties, affordable housing, what anyone wants in the future, that we can cater for it. Sorry, time.
Well, I have good news for several of you. You managed to answer all 3 questions in 1 minute, so now you have 2 minutes to expand on your answers. So part 2 is about the housing mix and regional areas accepting more tree changes, as we acknowledge, more than ever before, and it's a key part of attracting the workforce we need to have in our regional areas. So we hear you have policies to fast track the release of land. Do you have policies that will assist regional areas and incentivise regional areas to adjust their housing mix and fast track some of these other developments that are not as cheap as building on a greenfield site? And I think we're back to you, Susanna, for this one.
Sure. So given that I don't have a party, I don't claim to have policies, but I advocate for the community, and clearly housing is one of those issues, and a diversity of housing is really important. I think that we actually still have a lot of large families. We have the multicultural community who have much larger families than we do, and there is a need for housing for larger families. And then we know a lot of people who come to the hospital might only be there for a limited time, so just a really good apartment is all they need. There's been a much discussed opportunity around the increasing living within the CBD, and that is an opportunity, and there's only one person I know who has done it successfully, and he's sitting in front of me. So I think you know, that's something to be explored and perhaps challenged even more. You know, you talk about 400 houses a year. It's going to be really challenging, I think, to do that until we can get the land opened up, and it comes back to that availability. And then you deal with the rental problem by having more housing on the market, and that will then, you know, create the capacity for more people to be able to rent, which is really something that so many people in our community actually do, and more will be doing.
Thank you. Dan?
I'd like to see more family-friendly housing. I don't go along with this development in the CBD or close to the CBD thing. I think this is Agenda 21 United Nations or Agenda 2130. Many of you will be unaware of it, but I suggest you have a look at it. I don't believe high-rise housing is the way to go. One of the benefits of living here in Shepparton is that we do have room around us in our homes, but there are many people who just do want a simple flat or somewhere to live. But I think we can do that in such a fashion that they also have a bit of garden or open space around them or whatever. And this could be, I think the government needs to go back to community housing that's built on a modest scale for people who don't have a lot of money or temporarily need to live somewhere. And we haven't done that for years and years. In my young days, when I was first married, we had the Housing Commission homes, and many people I knew started off in those homes, and then as their families grew or they were, you know, better off, they moved on to something else. But we don't have that anymore. We need to get back to where government provides a level of that simple housing for those people to get a start in life.
Okay, thank you.
Can you please repeat the question?
This was the bit about housing mix and whether there are policies to incentivise the regional cities increasing their mix of housing away from what
I
was
thought you asked
traditionally
about
known.
policy. I was just refreshing, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, look, in terms of policies that have been announced for around the mix, yeah, we probably haven't gone there. It was mainly around the release of land, but also that did speak to affordable or not social housing, but affordable housing. But in discussions with developers, particularly local developers, there is still appetite for exploring quotas of, you know, different types of housing being built in certain developments. So they might be able to develop the land in certain ways, but there would be a certain percentage of the houses or the land that would be 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom units, things like that, sort of lower, smaller houses, but certainly affordable, or even social housing if that's was to be considered. But it would be built in community. So I think the variety of housing to be offered in community is really, really important. So yeah, I think releasing the land is the first start, but then having conversations, and I've said this before publicly, but I do work a lot with a place-based approach around, and I think we've got some opportunity to look at what our situation is here locally and identify what we need and work really hard towards that.
Ian?
I think if we're looking at the mix of housing, the glaring omission at the moment is affordable public housing. We used to have a department that built houses and made them available to people on low incomes at a reasonable price. But the demand is far outstripping supply. There's been very little building happening lately, and both governments, or both persuasions of government have been dropping the ball on building new affordable housing. So whether it's publicly owned or social community type housing, it's all needed. The demand is out there, and it'll put a floor on rents, I suppose, so that it's affordable, and it hopefully will have a downward, put downward pressure on the remaining housing stock out there to make the rest of the houses more affordable also. And there's lots of properties in Shepparton that are getting old, and it's just about time that something new and better was put in their place.
Okay. Kim?
Yes, a mix of housing, I mean, you have to have a mix of housing because there's such a broad range of needs when it comes to housing. And, you know, when I was on council, we had the affordable housing strategy where we worked with a lot of the service providers that would actually guide council in what those gaps and needs were. But I think the issues we have is developers come in, they want to make big dollars, and we lose control of land because we know when we're talking about affordable housing, social housing, it can be very restricted in the offerings. And we know we've had some opportunities, you know, through council. Some of those weren't successful. We need to look at better ways to actually address, particularly when it comes to social housing, because you know that's a very strong need within our community, and it's becoming bigger. And the way we have to do that, I think, is really working closely with service providers to find out what they need and work closely with councils to know what, you know, availability of land is there, but also they talk to a lot of developers, and not just high-end developers. They talk to developers that are looking at doing social housing as well. So we need to be really connected to those type of organisations and make sure the opportunities aren't missed for our region.
Okay, thank you. So the third part of that question was about a well-functioning rental market. I think each of you has already touched on that. So I'll save you the third part of the question and we'll move on. Thank you. We're skipping that one.
Right, so rising interest rates, inflation and the impact of floods and COVID on supply and supply chains mean the cost of living pressures are at the top of many minds for Shepparton households, and our industries have a lot of similar concerns. So we're home to about 20% of regional Victoria's manufacturing industry, and many of these industries are relying on a combination of electricity and gas. Our ag sector has been hit by floods, and sourcing feed for livestock or funds for sowing will continue to create challenges well into 2023. So the question is, what are your priorities for addressing these pressures for businesses at a state level? And Diane, you're up first, I believe.
I believe that we have gas resources still in Victoria that could be developed. I'm not in favour of closing down coal-fire power stations. At this stage, I think that we need to look to the future and be a little bit more inventive perhaps, but we have to understand that these businesses, when they go, nobody's going to start them again. If we don't look after the industry that we've got and protect them from these high costs, we're going to lose them. We'll lose with it the employment and the future stability of Shepparton. So I think we've got to be very practical about it, and I don't think, unfortunately, that we've got people in positions with the brains to tackle this. It's a major, major problem, and I think there's too much talking and not enough action, and really having people look closely at what could happen if we get this wrong. So,
Yep.
you know,
So to that point, what do we need to do then to keep those businesses here? You've spoken about the cost of them leaving, but what do we do to keep them here?
A lot of the costs of these things are tax. I mean, we pay a tax, a GST on our household power. The businesses are paying taxes on the power. We just need governments to get real about this and stop pussyfooting around with what the problem is. I think there's answers out there, and I don't have them all, but I'm a great believer there are answers out there. We just need people to get together with the brains and the goodwill to find those answers.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Well, I'll dedicate my minute to taxes as well. We've been quite transparent and very public about not introducing any new taxes, and we have announced that we would cut 7 of Labor's taxes, both targeting business and families. and manufacturing. So yeah, it's taxes. We're just seeing we've had 43 new taxes in the Labor government the last 8 years. Last election they said they wouldn't increase or introduce any new taxes, and they have constantly increased and introduced new taxes. So we'll be cutting taxes, and any funding that we've announced or committed to, it will be without any new taxes. And I think that's going to go a long way for business and families. A lot of the taxes are targeting hard-working families, people trying to, pay their bills instead of paying more taxes. So that's where I'm on time. That's where I'll dedicate my time.
Thank you. Ian.
Look, the state government's there to do a job, and that is to provide services, and they can't do that without an income source. And so to talk about building new hospitals and all these other great things, and then also cut taxes and get down debt, baffles me. I don't know how it's possible. But in terms of cost of living, look, the Greens have always been advocating more renewable energy. That's already driving down prices of power, and it's the cheapest new form of power that's available. It needs to be backed up, of course, with storage. But it's an opportunity for Shepparton, particularly in the north of the electorate. There's land available for solar. It's not the ideal place for wind, of course, but it's an opportunity for growth, for jobs, and if it's done fast enough at a faster rate than coal-fired power stations decommissioned, it'll bring down prices.
Thank you. Kim.
So just adding to some of that, so 100% of new natural gas supplies will be reserved for Victorian homes. It's one of our policies, and businesses, resulting in more reliable and affordable power for all. And we also have our solar rebates as well. So I think, when we look at the economic state of our state, and we are in so much debt, what is actually tagged to that is extra service costs. So that's something we've got to be mindful of. As we've talked about, we're not going to introduce any new taxes, and that's often how a government actually make up loss. So it's very important that we stick to that, and we make sure that businesses have got the cost-efficient way of getting their power sources, they're being able to pay their bills when it comes to their gas and electricity.
And finally for this one, Susanna.
So cost of living is about what you pay out every week, on your bills, buying food, all those sorts of things. And there's no doubt that energy is the killer, and it's going to be probably more so as we go forward if something isn't done about that. And in the immediate term, it'll be access to gas, and it's inconceivable to me that we just let all that gas go overseas so cheaply and didn't do anything about it like Western Australia did. And I just hope that the federal government will attend to that so that we can get gas prices down while we're transitioning through to something new. And the Goulburn Valley is absolutely well placed to get into that energy space, look at other ways of providing business and homes with the energy it needs. We produce more biomass in this community than probably anywhere else in Australia that could all be channelled into some form of energy production, and it really does need to be addressed both at a state and a federal level. But from a state point of view, we could have a big battery here. Is that something we might want to do to actually start storing some of the energy that we've got the capacity to produce once we, enter into this new phase?
Thank you. So our next question is on video, and it is going to bring up one of our favourite topics of roads and bypass.
I'm Taylor Hall, the Operations Manager at Valley Backing Marina. In the last 10 years, Australian exports have increased significantly. A lot of this product comes from both the Goulburn Valley and travels through the Goulburn Valley on its way to the Port of Melbourne. This has had a significant impact on both the Shepparton and Mooroopna CBD. Will you commit to funding the Goulburn Valley bypass from a state perspective, but also work with the federal government to ensure this is delivered sooner rather than later?
And I believe we're back to the start.
Emphatic yes. We've actually committed, not calling for or not promising, we've actually committed to start work on stage 1 of the bypass. As I said before, Labor's been in power for 19 of the last 23 years, and they're not interested at all in this major infrastructure project for our region. Someone has to get started on it, and if we're elected, we'll be the ones, Liberal government would be the ones to do that. It's a major part of infrastructure for planning, for what's coming, growth in our region. 25% of Victoria alone's transport industry is based here in Greater Shepparton. So yeah, a long time coming, and we've advocated very, very strongly for it, and delighted that we're able to commit to it, not just call for it, but commit to it.
So just to dive a bit deeper there, Cheryl, it will be a co-funded project with the federal government, so it's usually an 80-20 split, 80% Fed, 20% Victoria. So in terms of being able to commit to its completion, you've committed to the Victorian side of it if elected. Why are you confident you'll be able to secure the other 80% out of the federal government?
Well, we haven't committed to complete it, because we've committed 260 million to start the project. And talking to the advisory committee here locally, that was the position that they put to us very strongly to start at the start, because we needed to work out. We still haven't seen the business case from the Labor government. Very difficult to commit to a full project when we don't know what the business case looks like. But we seriously wanted to say to the electorate that it's a really important project, and we will commit to get it started. As for the federal government part of the funding, I believe the federal minister has recently said that the 208 million, I think it was, from the former federal government on the table is still in the budget and remains there. So it's really a great opportunity, or the door is open for us to work with the federal government to make sure it's not enough either in terms of its 80%. We know that the figure is around 1.2 billion, or that's what they've told us. So if I was the new member, I would be working very hard to work with the federal government to make sure that they would commit their part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Ian?
Look, I'm not so emphatic. I have some reservations about the current plan for the bypass. I really think they made a mistake years ago when they decided on the western route. I believe it should be going to the east. The path of destruction through the forest, particularly on the Toolamba end, would be devastating to that corridor. And I really don't think it should be funded until it's looked at again. I do believe that a second bridge across the Goulburn to the north of Shepparton, as planned, makes a lot of sense. We've seen that the existing crossings haven't been up to it, particularly in the floods. So certainly there's room for work there. But no, look, I'm still a big fan of rail freight. So look, if we're talking about moving freight around, I think we should be investing in rail.
Thank you. Kim?
So we are the major regional city without a bypass, and we know that this has gone on for many, many years. Efficient, safe movement of transport is critical, and the bypass is not just, my aspiration, it's a community aspiration, it's your aspiration, Lindy. I mean, we've all talked about this and we've lobbied for it for a very long time. So very happy, we've got the 208 million that has been confirmed, I think, just this week, that it is still there in the federal budget. And the 260 million that we've committed is the first time state has actually made a commitment. It's a project that needs to happen. We saw what happened with the causeway with the floods. We divided our communities. It became, extreme issues. It was critical that we, can function that causeway with a second river crossing. We won't have those issues arising. We saw it tonight. Some of us, yesterday, I was stuck on the causeway. Traffic was jammed. We've grown as a city. 30,000 vehicles use the causeway every single day. I was in Maribyrnong today, and the constant flow of trucks was just, it was mind-blowing.
Thank you. Susanna?
The bypass. Really, it's just such a political issue, and here we are with a Labor government in Canberra who'll have very little appetite for the seat of Nichols as far as I can see. But perhaps there's a chance if you have two Labor governments that they might be prepared to work on it. Is that possible? I think if you could get a real commitment out of whoever the Victorian government is, and probably a Labor government's going to have a better negotiating position with a federal Labor government, then you might get some. You might actually get some action, and it's not just about Shepparton and Mooroopna. We can absolutely see the impact that the floods and the current situation has with just some roadworks in Shepparton. The trucks, McCoy's Bridge closed, all these bridges closed. It is a major issue. I think step one, let's get it on Infrastructure Australia's list, and we've tried to do that. If we can achieve that, then we might get the federal government to start taking an interest in it. So first step is Infrastructure Australia, and then let's see whether we can get some traction after that.
Thank you. Diane?
We've been talking about a bypass here. I think it's probably nearly 50 years. And we actually did develop one. We have a bypass on one side of Shepparton, and it needs to be improved for the trucks that are going that way. But we do need to build a bridge, and we need to stop wasting money on looking at what we're going to do. I've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars just going on consultants and all sorts of things, wasting money. What we know now, and we realise we need a bridge. We need a second bridge. But for heaven's sake, whoever builds it, build it so that in a flood you can still get across it. Apparently in Echuca, they had trouble getting across their new bridge because of the floods. So we need some pretty clever people to come in here, some good engineers to design a bridge, and it'll have to go down that Wanganui Road and across that way. And it's a very practical idea. Let's just build the bridge and then look at what we need to get to and from, because we need to get those trucks off High Street and going through the middle of Shepparton, and I'm sure the truckies will be pleased with it too. It's too much traffic going down there, but we do need that for them. But we don't need a lot of the other roads that come and go. We need the bridge first, and I'm very much in favour of just pushing for that, but let's not waste any more money, let's just do it.
Thank you.
Right, so moving on to water, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is governed by the decisions of state and federal governments, and when Country News' Jeff Adams first explained it to me, my head exploded. If elected candidates, what's your strategy for ensuring the Victorian government's a strong voice for our region at the state level and the federal level? And can you outline the key policy priorities that you will want the Victorian government and the federal government to deliver for the area? And Ian, you're up first, but I've got a little extra bit for you as well. There's potential for the Greens to secure increased representation in the upper house and the lower houses in this election. So how will the Greens engage with regional communities like Greater Shepparton on issues like water?
Look, I'm an irrigation farmer, so matters of water are dear to my heart, but I've never wanted to farm at the expense of the environment. I try and be careful with my water use and get as much out of it as I can. So with that in mind, I don't want to be responsible for destroying the environment while I go about my business. And so if we need to secure extra water for environmental purposes, and there's been a very good case put forward that is needed, I'm happy to see buybacks of water from willing sellers. No one's going to force anyone to sell water, but what is required is not a significant portion in the overall Murray-Darling Basin. So I don't think our particular area's share would necessarily make any significant difference. So I think do it the cheapest and easiest way, which is to buy it back.
Fair enough. Thank you. Kim?
So the opposite to that. So the Nationals and I do not support any buyback of an additional 450 GL of water for environment flows through the Murray-Darling Basin. We will ensure that the socio-economic test is adhered to, and we support transparency in the water market. So brokers should be licensed, it should be managed. We will use any legal or legislative instrument available to stop the federal Labor government from purchasing water. You know, water is the key for our region. We depend on it. We know how much, you know, dairy farmers need water, agriculture, all the industries that we really represent are depending on water. And if we start making it difficult for them, or high-priced water, we're already facing incredibly difficult challenges. We've had dairy farms close. We've had historic generational businesses, you know, devastation in regard to water. So it's been very mismanaged. I do not believe that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan should be finished up anytime soon. There's still a lot of work to be done. There's winners and losers, and we're the losers.
Thank you. Susanna.
So I think how we manage the next 18 months, which are the most important now, we're just about at the end of the plan, and the audit will take place in 18 months' time, and we haven't delivered the water. It's a fact of life, and we can't deliver it on time, and the floods are slowing down all the projects that are meant to be contributing to that amount of water. So it's going to be about relationships, and it's about trying to get some flexibility back into the plan, and that will mean not folding your arms and saying, gosh, you know, aren't they bad? It'll be about opening channels of communication, and that is the way I work, and that is the way I will work in relation to the federal government. And we've opened up that channel just yesterday with a meeting with Tanya Plibersek, and it is important that whoever the state water minister is also holds the line that we've developed over the last 8 years, a really strong line that Northern Victoria matters, that water must not be taken out of Northern Victoria. We've given up all we can afford to give up at great loss to this community, but we've done that, but it's time to draw a line in the sand. So I think it will be relationships that will lead to the sort of outcome that this community needs.
So specifically for the question though, the policy priorities you want from, say, that next term of government, what do you want to see happen with that water?
Well, I think we'd be pretty clear that we don't want more buybacks from the region, really from any part of the consumptive pool, because every bit of water that now goes out of irrigation leads to a contraction of the wealth of your community. And we saw with the early studies that were done that in the first half of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, something like $500 million worth of value taken out of this region of Northern Victoria, the GMID, at the farm gate. We've seen the loss to our communities that has brought about. We've seen small schools close at Invergordon, at Katunga South. We can see on a day-to-day basis how our communities have been hollowed out, particularly the smaller ones. And those sorts of things really worry us. We want to maintain our communities. We need a critical mass of people in our community. So the notion of more buybacks is just an anathema to this region, and we really want to get the government to take more time to look at projects that will enable more water recovery, but by not taking it from the farmers who produce food, and we need food security.
Thank you. Diana.
Well, I think what we need is some less gutless wonders running the thing. I think we need to get rid of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. We had a good plan here in Victoria that was run by the 3 states without affecting our constitution. It worked well, and you have to go back into history to find the history of that, and it was wonderful what the people did in those days. We've just seen the most incompetent control of our water in this flood, when Eildon was holding so much water and they're letting it down. This flood wasn't just rain and local water. This was massive amount of water from Eildon flooding this area on top of that. And we've seen this destruction of our valuable community homes and everything through sheer incompetence. Now, it's happening all over Australia, and everywhere the Murray-Darling Basin goes, there's a problem. We need to get some really good brains, some competent, strong people to get control of this again. Study history and find out these people who developed the Murray system of irrigation were brilliant, but you have to read it. And I'm finding that people are just too lazy to read documents and read history and understand how we got to where we got in the Golden Valley and what's destroying it now. So I'd like to think that if I ever got into Parliament, that I could be a strong voice for the people and also be a person who could find people who had the brains to get us back on track.
Cheryl.
Yeah, I really believe that we've done the heavy lifting when it comes to the to water and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. I wouldn't like to see, and certainly would not be in favour of buybacks at all. I think, what the amount of water that's been taken already for environmental water is, we've certainly done our share. I wouldn't be supporting buybacks at all. Also the neutrality test, or the test that is put over the plan, or meant to be put over the plan, that if any further water was taken, then it was to cause any socio-economic and economic disadvantage to our communities, that it couldn't happen. So I really would advocate strongly that that should be the direction that we take.
Thank you. Ian started, so we're back to you now.
We are, and actually, you're handling the next bit.
The education bit.
Oh, sorry, turned the wrong page, ahead of myself. So sorry. We have a video question from Rowan Farron, a Greater Shepparton Secondary College student who has just completed his Year 12 exams, and it's on video.
Decisions made by the Education Department have a direct impact on us as students, and most students are not able to vote. I am one of thousands of secondary students in Shepparton who have just gone through 3 challenging years, including the transition from the 4 original sites to the new Greater Shepparton Secondary College site, as well as the detrimental effect which have occurred due to the pandemic and most recently the floods, which has devastated many communities around Shepparton. How will you ensure that our voices are heard in the development of the Greater Shepparton Education Plan and ensure that all students are able to meet their best outcome possible? Further, what services will you fight for in the area of mental health that is so greatly needed by everyone in our society, especially students and young people?
Thank you. So we are up to Kim. You're starting this one, aren't you?
Okay, so we have made a commitment, so we've committed to a consultation for a second site for education for another secondary school, public secondary school. We also have a policy in regard to treating mental health with students within schools, and that is that we have trained counsellors, not local government counsellors, that have qualifications that could be put, those qualifications could be put into the schools, so we would actually allow them to actually go into schools and address the mental health of students, because we know that that's not being met, and obviously this has been raised tonight exactly around that. So mental health for students, making sure that they're comfortable where they go to school, and obviously, as I said, we have committed to a choice of education through a thorough consultation process.
Thank you. Susanna.
So parents want their children to get the best possible education they can, and I think that's a given. And they weren't getting that back when I got it in 2014. And so a process of creation of a Shepparton education plan took place, and we've now got a state-of-the-art, incredible high school in Shepparton, probably the best in regional Australia, certainly regional Victoria. It's had to bring itself together during the most challenging of times, and yet it's done an outstanding job. And it was such a pleasure to read all the outcomes of the class of 2022, the first year that's gone through, and see the wonderful things that the school leadership had to say about the school. It has an incredibly good wellbeing group within the school that are there to provide a whole range of mental health services. There's a doctor in the school, there's a paediatrician in the school, there's a range of things, but more importantly too, in terms of significant mental health, the new mental health unit being built at Goulburn Valley Health will have dedicated beds for young people. They'll no longer have to go to Box Hill or out of town should they need hospitalisation. So in 1 minute, that's just a snapshot.
Thank you. Diane.
Me?
Yep, you.
Look, I have to say I'm not a fan of what I call the stupid school. I live round the corner from it. I'm absolutely fed up with Year 12 parking their car out the front of my house. My brothers can't even visit me without having to walk half a mile to get to it. It's just ridiculous. It was poorly planned and the whole thing I think is a disaster. We need another tech school in Shepparton. We need to get back to training builders, plumbers, electricians and work people, and we need more focus on learning in the schools and less woke rubbish. The schools are spending so much time. One of my grandsons went to a doctor at what was the high school and came home and said, "Do you know, Grandma, on her desk," and she was a supposedly Christian doctor, was a bowl of condoms. He was disgusted. He went in for some sensible advice and he just said, for heaven's sake, what's going on? Now, we need to get back to a stability. We need to treat our young people with respect. We need to teach them properly, and we need to get back to training in all the fields so that we can have these competent young, happy people, and we won't have so much of this mental health problem if they're happy and well educated.
Cheryl.
Yeah, look, parents do want their children to have a very good education, but they also want choice on where they can send their children and what sort of education they receive. So I'm not sure why Susanna continually denies that choice has been stripped from our Greater Shepparton region in public secondary education. To that end, we have committed to a second secondary school, and I've supported that in a number of roles that I've had in the community over the last 5 years. And we will work very closely with the community, give them the consultation process that they duly deserved in the first place, for us to work out what that second school looks like and where it should be, and that's firmly in the hands of the community. The Shepparton Education Plan, that's a completely different answer and point for me. I have real problems with the Shepparton Education Plan at the moment. It doesn't marry up between early education. It totally ignores middle or primary school education, and the secondary education is not the model fit for this region.
Okay. Ian.
Oh, look, I'm a great believer in the state education, state-funded education. It's the great equaliser, and I think if we're talking about providing for everyone, a well-funded state system is essential. That's why I'd like to see the new Greater Shepparton High School, secondary college, I should say. I'd like to see it succeed, and I think it's well on track to doing that. But let's not stop at talking about secondary college, because early childhood education, I think, is just as important, but sadly neglected much of the time, as is primary school education to a large extent. So the early years are critical and need to be given the funding they deserve. In terms of mental health, though, I think secular pastoral care is essential in schools, particularly when in the later years when kids are under a great deal of stress, and that needs to be well funded, and they need to be properly trained people taking that role.
Okay, thank you. So, Max, over to you.
There we go. So that concludes the formal Q&A session for this evening. So I believe we've got some time for questions from the floor. So yeah, while the team is getting set up with the microphones, we'll walk through some ground rules quickly. Yep. There you go. Apologies for that. So firstly, we'd like people to address their question to the entire panel of candidates, not just to one candidate. So individual questions can be directed to candidates following the event, but for the purposes of having everyone on stage, we'd like to have everyone be able to reply to questions. Secondly, please introduce yourself clearly before asking your question. And third, this is an opportunity to ask questions of the candidates, not to make a statement. You're welcome to provide a little bit of clarity around your question, but if you're taking more than 30 seconds, we'll prompt you to get to the point. And you can ask one question at a time, and then after that, maybe time permitting, we might be able to get you to grab a second one, but at this stage, it'll be one question per person. We've got some in the front row.
Michael Curtis is. Okay, sorry. With regards to your mental health policies for youth, who have you consulted in regards to putting those forward or planning them?
So will Kim, you started the last one, did you?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
So we will be actually connecting obviously with industries that have those qualifications. So there will be an opportunity, it could even be people from a retired mental health background that want to come back into the workforce. So it's really people that have a qualification that can apply to go into the schools. So it's not going to be a specific policy for a specific group, it's actually a qualification that will be identified to be able to come into the schools and treat mental health.
So that means you haven't actually done any pre-plan?
Well, we have a policy in place for people that have a qualification that could be repurposed into our schools and maybe encourage people to come back into the workforce.
They will. Yeah.
Well, we want qualified people be able to treat mental health within schools.
Yes. So
and to be able to fill a gap that is there.
Well, we'll move on to Susanna and just keep it at one question per person. So, Susanna, in terms of who you've spoken to and...
Yeah, so during COVID, quite a few young people contacted my office and I met with them and their biggest complaint was, you might be in a crisis and you've got to wait 6 weeks for an appointment. And so the whole issue around that was really concerning and as you know, there was quite a bit of additional funding put into all our mental health services during that period to try and get young people more access to it, and we have Headspace in Shepparton. But more recently, I've met with a group of young people who, it's so concerning that mental health is such an issue for young people, and they identified the sort of the lack of services just on a basic sort of like probably the Headspace sort of service, just the need for more people in those sorts of spaces, often someone to talk to share their concerns and to maybe get a bit of relief from that, because often you can't talk to your family. But I think also the work has been done to show that we do need actual beds here in the Goulburn Valley to treat people with serious mental health issues, and we've been able to lobby to get beds for young people here in what will be the new mental health unit. We haven't had that.
Thank you, Diane.
I'm very concerned about how many people we have, not only young people, with mental health issues. And I would like to work towards avoiding it, trying to get back to some stability where we haven't got so many problems. And I think often, from my observation, I've got 12 grandchildren, only one still in the system, the others are out working. A stable family home, which is not the norm these days, is a lot of the problem. So supporting often the families of these children to get, them back stable as well, so the children have got somewhere, that they feel safe and happy, and get back to just very more basic way of life and stop putting all the pressures of the world on the shoulders of young people. These problems are for older people and adults, and these young ones are going to school and they're discussing all these problems. Is it any wonder they're upset and unhappy? We need to sort of get back to a little bit of common sense, I think, and that will help a lot, I think, with the young people. So that's my attitude to it, and I suppose I could be attacked on it, but I do have compassion for people that have got problems, but a different way perhaps of looking at how we get past that, help them.
Cheryl?
So the question was about who did we consult before any sort of policy had come out. So particularly in the schools, there was much discussion through the pandemic in particular, which this has been highlighted, they acknowledged, or people in our party acknowledged and was able to speak to people firstly in schools. They had a lot of school nurses, teachers, and obviously the leadership at the schools were reporting real concerns around mental health. So counsellors, psychologists, even research that had been done that were coming out through universities around youth mental health. So the policy is about trying to get better access for young people, not necessarily around the specific treatment and who exactly should be that person. But it was identified, it's easy to say we need 400 or we need a counsellor or a psychologist in every school in Victoria, which would be the goal. But with worker shortages and those sorts of challenges, we were then able to identify maybe it's counsellors who could be given a greater exposure to those qualifications or accept their qualifications to get into the schools to start working with those young people, and then it could very well be a referral process or, you know, some other sort of wraparound care for them. So that's how that policy was developed.
Thank you. And Ian?
Well, in terms of how I find out about these issues and what needs to be done about it, a lot of it actually comes from the media. I listen extensively to a number of shows on Radio National which often delve deeply into issues of mental health. But more anecdotally, just casual conversations, particularly with a number of young people, does highlight just how hard it is to get treatment when it's needed most. But in terms of policy, I haven't written any of the policy, but the people who have, the Greens policy is written by people who are well educated and trained and know much more about mental health issues than I do, and the Greens policy is quite comprehensive and I think worth looking at.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. My name is Robert McLean. The Shepparton electorate, along with the rest of the world, will be some 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures by the end of this century. So what plans do you have to mitigate those rising temperatures and prepare people here for such huge and alarming changes?
Thank you. We'll start with Susanna. Kim started the last one, so we'll start with you this time. What's your policy around climate change and how do we limit global heating?
Well, I think I share a lot of your concerns, Robert, and with COP20 happening at the moment and, you know, incredible droughts in the Northern Hemisphere and floods, you know, right across our regions here in Australia. You look at the floods in Pakistan, there's no question in my mind that the issue of climate change needs addressing. And at every step of the way during the last 8 years, I've supported any legislation that it tries to address that. A lot of that has been around energy. It's been around stopping fracking, which was something that everyone in the Parliament supported when it went through. And it's about getting into the space of green energy. We've got to really reduce emissions, and it seems to me that here in Victoria, the main way we're going to do that is move to a green economy to deal with energy in a way that is eventually getting to net zero, and that is certainly the goal that I would support.
Thank you, Diane.
As Robert knows, I'm not a believer in climate change. I am very concerned about our environment and what we're doing to our environment, our food production, our health, medications given to people and that sort of thing. You know, tonight I could do with a little bit of global warming, actually, because I'm not happy that I've got to go home and probably put the heater on to feel comfortable. But we've worked very hard to get to this point where we use energy to make our lives easier. But what we need to do is to develop people, encourage people and have people that get some answers to the pollution of our environment. And that is a worry to me, because the more we talk about some of these other issues, the less we're looking at what we're doing, what we're even feeding our animals, what we're putting on our gardens, what our children are exposed to, and what it's doing to their long-term health. So I am concerned about the health of the environment, just not a climate changer.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yeah, well, the health of the environment, certainly. When I talk to young people I expect them to talk to me about climate change because they are in that age bracket, and we've had the discussion before, but they often talk about the environment and not mention climate change, because I often think people, the big picture is really scary, and what can they do? What sort of impact can they have? Where would they start? So often the environment comes up because they think they can do things themselves in their own backyard. But certainly the Liberal Party, we've introduced a policy around solar panels or subsidies for solar panels up to $1 million on 1 million roofs throughout the state, and also the batteries, and double the subsidies for people in or people who own rental properties to try and encourage that as well. So if we're talking about energy, that's something that we're doing. And also we've legislated our reductions by 2030, not just made a target and not just made the promise, but we said that we would legislate those targets so we can be held accountable.
Thank you. Ian, do the Greens have any climate change policies?
Yeah, I believe we do. Yeah, look, I'm a farmer, and I've been doing the job for long enough now that I think I can see the changes happening around me, and this year's one of those years out of the box. It's totally unexpected. So look, no new mines. It's a no-brainer. No fracking. No new gas projects. The Greens plan is to have 100% renewable energy by 2030. That means we've got to phase out our coal power stations quicker than the current government is planning, and we need, it's going to take a huge investment, of course, and there's a role for the government in that. We're well placed to be part of the solution because there's huge parts of this electorate in northern Victoria that are suitable for renewable power generation, but there needs to be investment in transmission, in storage. But also we need to electrify everything, so charging stations, and on it goes.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
we do have a policy, as Cheryl's mentioned. We're taking steps towards a zero by 2030. We need to meet the challenges of a changing climate, and it needs to be managed. I think this is the thing. We need to make sure that we protect our natural environment. We invest through different technologies, and really think about the way the world is leading climate change and how we can actually learn from that. Obviously, with the renewable energy practices that we're doing, there's mitigation there to improve across many of our policies, but I think when we look at the way we do things at the moment, it's really making sure the impact is not severe. When we look at industries and businesses and people that really need to take their time to manage what the impact might be on them. So we need to, just work through the technology and make sure that it's done in an efficient way.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you to all the candidates for the answers so far. Thank you. My question's a little bit different. My name's Alison Gray. Sometimes it's very easy to get carried away with the big issues in an election, but what about the small everyday problems of everyday people in our electorate? My friends are an Arabic refugee family in Shepparton. They have been here 3 years, and they would dearly love to bring their oldest daughter and her family to Shepparton too. Currently they are in Jordan at a refugee camp. How would you advise this family, knowing the tricky visa arrangements, language and financial difficulties this family face?
Rightio, so the question around how you'd advise somebody looking to move to Shepparton. Diane, you're up first.
Look, I'm not in favour of further immigration until we settle and make sure our local people have homes. So while I'm sympathetic to them, because I can understand having a family somewhere else is difficult, I tend to look to our people we have here now to make sure they have stability, homes, health, and that first. So while I have sympathy for them, I don't know which way they should go. I wouldn't know how to advise you on that.
Yeah. And Cheryl?
Yeah, so the question was about what advice would we give them, not what we would be trying to do for them.
Well, what advice would you give them? What advice would you give them? Sorry, knowing the tricky visa arrangements, okay, and the obvious language and financial difficulties that migrants face these days. How would you advise this family about what they could do to bring their other child and her family to Shepparton?
Yeah, well, we have identified that we are sympathetic to the amount of time, paperwork, cost often, and the barriers to bringing other families. I was out at the Sikh temple not so long ago and I had a number of families approach me in exactly the same position. Without knowing that particular family's position, I'm not sure if it's a federal government issue as a visa, but if we had to try and advise them, I think I'd have to learn and look at what those barriers and challenges are, how we might be able to support them to reduce the time or potentially the cost, or find out the reasons why the extended family, you know, why aren't they able to come? Is it just purely a visa situation, or is it cost, or is it the fact that they have to have somewhere to live when they get here, all those things. So, yeah, I would certainly have to find out more detail, but if they're a family in my electorate and I was to be their member, I would certainly, because of my understanding and my work with multicultural communities now, I would certainly be trying to do everything I possibly could for them. The time that it takes, it's not necessarily a no, but the time that it takes is a real barrier. Yeah.
Thank you. And Ian?
Look, to answer the specifics of the question, my first advice would be to make contact with the Ethnic Council in Shepparton. They have the facilities and the people there with the language skills and the knowledge and contacts, I believe, to help people in this situation. So definitely that would be my first suggestion. But, you know, just to stray into federal politics a little bit, I do think the visa arrangements at the moment do very much favour people who have a lot of money and can sort of sidestep some of the other, well, the family migration visas and so on. So I do think our migration policy is a bit skewed, but that's a bit off topic.
And Kim?
Yeah, when I was mayor, it was constant, you know, people coming to me in regard to needing assistance in this space, and it was often a federal issue. However, as a community member, I was always, you know, supportive of whether it was a letter or whatever I could do to help. We do have something actually within our policies. We will provide an additional $3.3 million over 4 years for the ethnic communities. So the Council of Victoria, ECCB, to better serve multicultural communities. So that's going to, you know, give some funds there, because it's obviously something that we're probably not going to be able to do as well. They are a peak body that supports and advocates for migrant and refugee communities. So that's funding we're putting up. But I saw so many tragic cases where families were divided. Then, of course, we had COVID and there was all those other disconnect, and even just getting people back to being able to get back to their families has been you know, really challenging for many within our community. And with the broad multicultural community that we have, I think we almost need a designated person to really support some of these community members, because it's becoming constant. When I was mayor, as I said, it was very constant, people needing this type of support.
Thank you. And Susanna?
It's one of the really hard things that happens when you're the state member and you're confronted with a federal problem. There's very little about visas that sit with the state government, just a few little things, and we've been able to help people with those. But when it's family reunion and migration issues, it very much sits with the federal government, and we certainly always work with the federal member and send people over there. They actually do have someone who, you know, they have people within their federal office who understands Centrelink, who understands immigration, and who does work to help people. In terms of community support, the Ethnic Council obviously also just provides some grassroots support and assistance and talk people through what a lot of the challenges are, you know, from a family point of view while they're waiting to have those issues dealt with.
Thank you. Do we have many more?
Thank you very much. My name is Monga Mukasa, and I've got a question for, obviously, for everyone. And my question is, we do understand that it was only briefly touched base about our young people, and our young people do play a major role in our town, considering that what we've seen in Japan, having such a mature nation. But my direct question is, because you did mention earlier in your discussion about how there is a shortage and we need to look back into our backyard in terms of profession to keep our professional workers and so on. So if you were elected, how are you going to go about in making sure that our young people do stay in Shepparton so that we can actually bridge that gap? So that's my question.
There we go. So Cheryl, how do you keep young people here?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you, Monga. Well, keeping them here, basically coming out of education, they'll be looking to go on to further education and obviously building our opportunities there. We do have universities here and an expansion of the types of courses that can do. So trying to retain our young people here to educate them or train them. And as I said before, we do know historically that if we're training or people come here for further education, they're likely to put down some roots here and stay here, and then we benefit from those qualifications or those skills. The other thing is, again, it comes back to housing. I know of a couple of families at the moment that are looking to relocate because their young people just can't break into the housing sector. Not just rental, but even to be able to buy their own homes. They're looking at regions where there's opportunity for them to buy their own home. So housing does play into that, but the rental market also. We need more rental stock, and it's such a complex issue. Employment, well, we've all heard that there's worker shortages and there's lots of opportunity for people to take on jobs here, but they need to be the type of jobs, I guess, for young people. They interest young people, or it's the jobs that they want. So we do have to have that mix as well. Again, retraining young people, getting them to stay here and retrain for the jobs that are here or expose them to them. I think that's another way to do that. And a great social life.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, look, I was going to touch on housing also. I think by the time people leave school and into the workforce, they've probably had enough of living with mum and dad. So affordable housing, particularly in the early years, or the first years on your own, you want to be renting. But yeah, a social life. So you know, the facilities, the arts, the cafes, the restaurants and so on. I think Shepparton's actually doing a really good thing in providing things to do that aren't just work. So a lot of it is out of control of governments really. We just need to sort of facilitate the planning to make it easy for venues to operate and to provide a lifestyle and the non-work activities that people need in a community.
Thank you. Kim?
So I met with members from the Afghanistan community just yesterday, and one of their big issues was being able to support their children to complete particular career paths that weren't offered in Shepparton. So their big issue was expanding university offerings, and we're seeing that happening. It's quite slow. I've got two daughters. One of them studied teaching, one started but didn't finish because she just wasn't comfortable where she was living. So, you know, I think the offerings of, you know, really building up our universities. We are growing as a regional city. We know population growth is happening, and there are issues around that, as we've talked about, with housing, etc. However, for this family that were talking to us yesterday, the whole family is moving to Melbourne because the daughter does not go and study by herself. So the whole family is relocating to Melbourne so that their daughter can have the opportunity to get a career that she wants to have. So I think it's the future around expanding our universities, continue to put, and we know that that's what we need to do to be a really progressive city. You can actually do teaching here in Shepparton now, and that's only been very recent. So it's slow and it's happening, but it needs to continue. We need more strength within our universities, more growth and more offerings and opportunities to keep our kids here that want to stay here, many will, and that they have that opportunity to study here and stay here.
Thank you. Susanna.
Thanks for the question. It's I think a lot of what the others have said I agree with, but your community needs to be able to provide a whole lot of things for young people that are often harder to get in a country area than the city. I think one of the really important things is trying to attract them back, because many will go away for education, and the biggest challenge then is to see whether we can get them to come back to Shepparton as, with their professions, with their training, whatever it is they've gone away to do. And very often it is more specialised courses, because while there are some courses here that are offered by La Trobe and there's the medical school, there are many that are not, and we will always face that issue of many going away, but there's also too many young people here who can't get the education they want because they can't afford to go and live in Melbourne. Their families can't afford for them to go there and do the courses they want, and they're not eligible for youth allowance for some reason. City kids get to stay at home whether they like it or not, Ian, and that's an incredibly cheap alternative for young people while they're getting their education, to be able to live at home, go home at night, and that's not a luxury that we have here to the same extent. So it's an ongoing challenge, and there's certainly some young people in our community I've talked to who are very adamant that there needs to be changes around the youth allowance to just create much more flexibility in terms of young people being able to go away and come home. And I also think that the increase in public transport, with 9 services a day, it does create a much more fluid society here in Shepparton for people to jump on a train, go to a footy match and come home, go to a concert and come home, go to university for 2 or 3 days a week and come home and hold down a job. So the options that are now expanding because of what is happening in the city is great.
Susanna. You got 2 bells, don't maybe get the hook out and just yoink you off stage. Diane, how do we keep young people in Shepparton?
Well, I think happy families and stable families is the important way, so they do come back. But we talk a lot about university education and training away from home, but we need to look at looking after our businesses here so they train our young people in the skills that are needed and that we are very short of in this area. So I would encourage an education system that also passed on to children, that there's more than just university education to develop a good future. And if their families are happy and stable, they're going to want to raise their own families around that family. So I'm very much into looking at, getting a little bit more stable situation within our community.
Thank you.
I've got one here. Is there anyone else? Because we really do have to wrap up.
There was one down the front as well.
All right, so I might take one down the front and one here, and then we'll finish up.
Thank you. Christopher Brooks from Nathalia. COVID-19 has got to be an extraordinary can of worms. Fairly recently, in a European parliamentary inquiry, a Pfizer executive made the public confession that the mRNA vaccines were never tested to determine their impact on the spreading of the virus. Yet this was something that was foundational in the policies across the world, and the mandates were obviously justified by this claim. Yet it is now becoming commonly understood in a courtroom in New York. Just recently a decision was handed down because of this information, and workers were to be returned to their jobs, their wages repaid and compensated.
Well, what's the question that you want the candidates to ask?
what will you do to deal with this corruption regarding COVID-19, and what will you do to rectify the injustices that have been done to all the people thanks to these mandates, including many people in my family who lost our jobs, careers, contracts, and were isolated in our communities and refused entry to local events, all based on something that, for those that are well informed, know was based on corruption.
So the question is around what will the candidates do if elected to look back over the last 4 years, hold power to account as we've had asked. So we're up to Ian, are you first or is Cheryl first? I've lost track.
Look, I'm a big fan of vaccines, and to some extent lockdowns. It's Australia. We did it tough. There's no doubt about that. But we've only had 1/10 of the deaths per head of population or per 100,000 or whatever, compared to places like America or parts of Europe. So something was working, and part of that is the use of vaccines. Now, we know that they're not 100% effective in preventing spread, but they are partially effective, and they do stop people dying. So look, it's part of a strategy, and I fully understand why the government, the state government at the time, mandated it. The mandates are less required now because so many people have been vaccinated that the virus is sort of under control. It's nothing like as rampant as it was 12 months ago. So something's working, and a big part of that is vaccines, and I would encourage everyone to get everyone that they're eligible for.
So just to clarify for the question asking about, what would you do in terms of looking back? Is there anything you do looking back, just briefly?
Oh, no.
Or you're happy with how
I think the policies that were put in place were justified under the circumstances, so I don't think there's any compensation required.
Kim?
Look, I think we all know that vaccination worked. It saved lives. I think what we do need to think about is the way it was managed as far as the rollout of quarantine and the whole process of COVID, the impact of that. I think there definitely needs to be an inquiry. But as far as vaccinations go, I think, it was all very new to all of us how it was going to roll out and what was going to happen. But I do think, we're all feeling the impact of the loss of businesses, the loss of, connection. I would be really keen to have a review more of the process, of what actually the impact of COVID has been and the way it was managed.
Thank you. Susanna?
So I'm married to a paediatrician who saw children cough themselves to death, babies from whooping cough, children who died from all sorts of things, and he hasn't seen that for 40 years. Because that's what vaccines have done for our society. They play a really important role. Now, during COVID-19, I'll never forget the 23rd of March when Daniel Andrews stood up and said, we've got to do something, we've got to lock down the state. I'll never forget Morrison saying, we've got to shut all our international borders. Like, these were major steps that were taken by our governments, and people generally were very supportive of the steps that were taken on the best health advice available at the time. I will always stand by following the best health advice available at the time, and I think that's what's happened. But there's a lot of aspects around what happened over the last 2.5 years that could be looked at. It's like when you have a flood, you have a look at what you could have done better, and I think it's always worthwhile to then review what's occurred and have a think about what we might be able to do better should it occur again.
Thank you. Diane?
Well, the Freedom Party was started purely on this issue because the people who looked at this issue believed it was one big con. I'm not a vaccinated person for COVID, and I have been appalled by the people, even sick people who should never have had the vaccination, who have been coerced and forced into having it. If you want to have it, that's your choice. But this is not a country under our constitution that is supposed to do that. And Morrison stood back and allowed it to happen, and Daniel Andrews has to be held to account for the deaths. Now, there's 17% increase in deaths not related to COVID over the last year or so. An increase, that's statistically. What some of the doctors are saying, that this vaccination and COVID itself, but the vaccination as well, has caused heart issues in people, and they can tell this by the level, I think it's tryptophan or something, I might get that wrong, that's in your blood. That's what happens when you have a heart attack. This level increases, and that's how they test, and they can tell that you've had it. So we've got a massive increase, especially amongst young people, of myocarditis, which means that their heart is damaged. Now, it might be mild and they might get away with it, but this is serious stuff, and we need a full investigation into Daniel Andrews and his hotel quarantine, because I believe I know where the millions went, and it was to a mate of his who ran that whole show so badly. Millions of dollars given to somebody who was a mate. There was a 6-minute window, and that's what happened.
You've had your time, Diane. Sorry to interrupt, but you've had the time. Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you. I think vaccinations were warranted. I think vaccinations, as Ian said, the history has shown our situation and around deaths and even illness. Unfortunately, though, Victoria was the most locked up city in the world, not just in Australia. We've been locked up, locked out, locked in. People weren't able to come home to their own homes from other states. I'm really in favour of an investigation into how it was dealt with at the time. I think a lot of the responses were far over or too extreme for the situation at the time, particularly in regional centres that weren't afflicted through the pandemic, as in other populated areas. But I think vaccinations themselves have spoken for themselves, but I'm also personally in favour of choice around that.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got our last question for the night.
Thank you, Dr. Leah Campbell, spokesperson for reopening Moortna High School. Two big public policy issues to do with our campaign. One is affecting more broadly the public education funding, in that time and lieu provisions in the new school agreement aren't being funded, which means that a large number of excursions, especially in regional and rural Victoria, who are forced to attend events elsewhere, whether that's professional development for teachers or sporting competitions in Melbourne or wherever they need to go. These things are unfunded, so I'm wondering about your position on that. And secondly, of course, we had the ERIN inquiry, which is the Work Integrated Learning inquiry in the state of Victoria, who's had 32 recommendations to have a more centralised approach to placements. In Moortna Park Primary School, a lot of low SES kids have no access to professional help other than through placement students. And I would like to say, how would you deal with those issues if, in fact, it would be appealing to you to see reopen Moortna High School as an innovative academic and vocational option for people in the Greater Shepparton area?
So we've got the two-part question there, three-part question.
In a minute.
We might have to go to a minute and a half for this one, and that'll do us. But yeah, looking at more funding for students to be able to go on excursions, and then looking at help for more teachers, especially Moortna Park Primary School, and then talking about the Moortna College as well. So Kim, Ian started the last one, so you're up first for this one. Yep. Or did Kim start the last one?
Doesn't matter. Look, two parts of it I'm not really sure where to go, but I do think that the Moortna School should be opened again. I find it quite bizarre that at a time where we're worried about the environment and wastage and kids travelling, that we've got all these students on this side of the river going over to the stupid school, spending hours a day on buses, that they could be living their life and enjoying it, less mental stress. Let's get back to educating them here. So, you know, I feel fairly strongly about that.
Yeah, thank you, Diane. Cheryl?
Yeah, so firstly, it's not around the changes to how teachers are paid for overtime. It's more about extra school activities. So not the school camps. That
so what happened is that we're now paying teachers for all the time they actually work. And so if they go on a camp, you might have, to Central Australia, you might have 23 days of days you owe this teacher.
Yep.
And you don't have that in your budget as a final component as a public school.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion or a lot of outrage, I guess, from the schools about the change in that, because the consequence of that is that the school camps and other activities off school that take teachers away are going to be jeopardised. A lot of the schools are making the decision that they can't run school camps anymore, and it's mainly around the overtime and the time in lieu. That's the difference. So I'd certainly have to look at that and the impact, but obviously the impact the schools are telling us and teachers are telling us that there's a really negative impact, and they didn't think through that change in the way that they pay teachers well. I'll skip the other one because I can't actually remember it, but the Mooroopna School, we've said, and I've been advocating really strongly for a second secondary school site in Greater Shepparton. I think Mooroopna's got a good case, a strong case about the school. What does reopening look like? What does the education model look like? What are you really asking for in terms of opening the school? I think that needs to come out in part of that community consultation that we're talking about. But I agree there needs to be a school on this side of the river.
Thank you. Ian?
I believe that teachers are not well enough paid as it is. So if we want to get qualified, or the best qualified teachers, we need to provide a package to encourage the best and brightest to go into teaching. That's the Greens policy. I believe that also. The Greens also believe that schools should be funded sufficiently so that parents don't have to keep digging into their pockets for school excursions, so that people from less well-off families don't have to miss out on such things. And thirdly, the Mooroopna High School, well, I'm one of the alumni of the school. I was the second person in the gate on the first day it opened. I can remember that quite clearly. But sadly, the fact is that the school was in decline before the new school was built. And unless something can be done to provide an option that people actually want to attend, I'd like to see a very strong case put forward for why the school would need to be reopened.
Thank you, Ian. Kim?
We know that teachers do a lot of after-hours unpaid work for their students. My daughter's a secondary school teacher. And the last thing we would want to see is underfunding for social activities where they often may not get that opportunity at home. You know, a lot of parents can't afford to take their kids away or may not have the time or whatever reason it might be. Many miss out on that opportunity. So, you know, socialising post-COVID is more important more than ever. And if it can happen within the school system outside their normal academic stress, we don't want to take that away. And I think we need to be having more offerings for families to be able to, whether it's grants or funding to be able to support the schools, but also families outside of school as well, because I think the social interaction of those activities you're talking about, some of them culturally may not be allowed to do it at school. I think it's a really broad discussion of what is needed, across the broad, whether it be in school or outside of school activities. In regard to the school, we've talked about having a thorough consultation process for the community to have input to what that should look like, and I'm very supportive of that, to have choice.
Thank you. And Susanna, to wrap us up.
Can I answer that?
I think certainly school excursions and things like that are such a pivotal part of kids' experience at school, and for regional kids the school trip to Canberra, the school trips to Parliament in Melbourne, and you just see the delight that these young children have when they come to those sorts of events. So I'd certainly like to see, the funding that's required to make sure that that sort of thing still happens. As far as this second Greater Shepparton, the Mooroopna Secondary School site goes, there's great opportunity here, and I think it is so important that whatever happens here is part of a consultation that includes Mooroopna people. And the Westside Performing Arts Centre, which we're sitting in now, was state of the art when it was built, and it's still pretty good, but it really needs a lot of refurbishment. I'd like to see considerable expenditure on all of this area and out and around it to really develop it into the prime performing arts space for this region, and to then look at what the options are for the remainder. And to build on the arts story is something that a community might like to see. We've got many community arts groups who have no home, nowhere to operate from. People are saying they'd like studios, all sorts of things. And that doesn't rule out some sort of educational institution, even perhaps the Victorian College of the Arts having an interest in it. I've been to the Footscray Secondary College and seen a farm school right on their grounds. So I think there's many ideas and opportunities that should make this the beating heart of Mooroopna.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, candidates, for this evening. We have one final step, which is a very quick, and I'm sure it's very practiced by now, wrap-up comment from each of you to close out. While you're putting your thoughts together, I'd just like to acknowledge Max for partnering with us tonight, but also Jodie, Andrew, who got co-opted in at the last moment, Christine, for your assistance with the mics and also all the work you did in preparing for this evening's event, and the guys in black up the back for all the work you did setting us up, recording it, so we can all sit back and watch this all over again, and also for keeping the mics and air conditioning going, because both seem to be working very well down here. So with that very brief pause, and we are in the home straight, who are we up to starting this one?
I think Susanna's up to start this one.
Susanna, there you go. Would you like to close us out with your
Look,
minute?
thanks to the Committee for Shepparton for putting this on tonight. I think it's a great opportunity to be able to have all of us say what we want to say, because the fact is we have hardly any regional media other than the Shep News and the Advisor, and we all know what there is, but there's no television, there's no opportunity for us to really be able to share our thoughts with the community. So this has been a great opportunity. I'm standing because this community really matters to me. I've been in it for a very long time. We've missed out on a lot. We've been able to deliver a lot. We as a community have really got together in the last 8 years to get things happening, and that train trip to Melbourne was one of the exceptional ones. There's more to be done. Everyone says a Labor government is going to win. Maybe not at this table, but out there in the world of politics, it's everyone's saying it's hard to see that they'll lose 18 seats. So if they're there, I will continue to work with them to try and deliver for Shepparton, to represent the interests of this community, and to do it in a way that doesn't just mean stamping my foot and folding my arms, but building relationships and working to get outcomes.
Thank you. Diane.
Thank you for having us here tonight. It's great to have the opportunity. What I'd like to say to people here is that think seriously about how you're going to vote. Think about those young people out there who are struggling in a world that's different to the one we grew up in, and do your homework. Look at the real issues, the real future, what really matters, to make sure they're stable and happy and they carry on their lives in such a way that honours those people who developed this country, so that we would have freedoms, the ability to speak out and to come to a meeting like this and, you know, be able to voice our opinions without being lynched. Thank you. Cheryl.
Yeah, so despite Susanna's predictions constantly that the Labor government's going to win, I'm working very, very hard to try and return a Liberal government to govern Victoria. And it's really curious, you know, we've touched on the issues tonight, and they've also come up constantly through the election. Roads, and we've committed $1 billion for 10 years, so $10 billion to fix the roads, not just lower speeds or you know, fix up potholes. The clinical school that Susanna's been calling for, we've actually committed to. We said we will deliver that if we're elected. The bypass, $260 million to start the bypass, stage 1, and not once has Susanna actually acknowledged any of those. So while she says that she's happy to work with anybody or everybody, I just can't see that happening, and I just wouldn't like to see another 4 years of the same. Housing is exactly the same. We've made commitments, and we will be able to make inroads to housing, and I'd like to be the member to be able to do all of that.
Ian.
I'd like to again thank the organisers, the Committee of Greater Shepparton and Shep News, for putting this on, and for people to come out on a cooler than expected night. I know I'm one of the underdogs in this race, but I just want to point out that every vote for the Greens is a message to the rest of the Victorian government to do more to fund the essential services that we all require, to take action on the climate and to help with the environment, and to assist those people that are being left behind. And also, don't forget the power of preferential voting. Votes for a candidate who are not successful are not a wasted vote. They will retain their full value if they're passed on to your second or third preference. So just think of that when you go to cast your vote. Thank you.
I'm standing for the seat of Shepparton because I've obviously had 6 years' experience in government, and I want to continue. I want to keep working hard for our community. I've led our community through the COVID, through the coronavirus time. It was an incredible time for all of us. We need to stick together. We need to make sure we have the right leadership. The Nationals, I'm glad Susanna used the word we. We have delivered for our region. I mean, the infrastructure that we have talked about, or Susanna's saying the 1.1 billion, federal funding, state funding, local council contributions. I'm sure it's in that figure, and I think it's been not fair to actually inform the community. So here I am informing the community that it takes more than a state member to achieve for our region, and I'll be very happy to work with and continue to work, particularly with the federal government. Our local council do incredible work, and I want to keep advocating for our community. The Nationals have our infrastructure fund. 25% of the budget should be spent in regional Victoria. That is not happening. It must happen. And the Nationals are the only party, as I've said, that solely support regional Victoria, and I will lobby extremely hard and continue to do the hard work that I've been doing.
Thank you. So that concludes a marathon effort. Actually, looking at my watch, it's longer than a marathon. I'd like to thank our candidates, and if you'd like to give them a round of applause for the... And while you're clapping, I suggest you give a round of applause to yourselves for sitting through such a long session, and I didn't see many of you falling asleep. There might have been a few quiet snoozes on occasion. Again, thank you for your participation. Thanks for coming out on a Tuesday night. And we have 11 days to submit our votes and make up our mind as to who we would like to represent Shepparton in the Victorian Parliament for the next 4 years. And I hope tonight has helped you understand our candidates, understand what they have to offer, and also make a more informed decision on your election ballots this year. So thank you.